Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to be back in this big room. Thank you for coming today. And this will be a very visually and interesting program today about Alaska. Barry recently in the summer took a cruise along the Inside Passage of Alaska and has wonderful photos and information to share with us. And so that we can all listen clearly and easily, we would ask that you turn off your cell phones or mute them, please. And please join me for a warm welcome for Barry Pell, photojournalist and world traveler.
Thank you, Sarah. It's wonderful to be back. Happy New Year to everyone. And thank you for attending this program on Alaska entitled The Last Frontier, based on some relatively recent travels from just the middle part, late spring, early summer of last year. So this, for those of you who've been to many of my other programs, you may certainly recognize that this is perhaps not quite as exotic as some of the places I've described in India or Southeast Asia or Africa. But indeed, Alaska has its own unique history and culture. We learned in school, of course, that Alaska had been a Russian territory for decades, and it was ultimately purchased by the United States in the mid-1800s for pennies on the dollar, pennies on the acre, and it was certainly a very economical place to buy, but it was derided at the time as a great folly, as a complete waste of money. But of course, we know that it's come to be known as, and valued as a national treasure. But even before that purchase, for thousands of years, the lands of Alaska were occupied by many different indigenous tribal peoples, and they were able to survive in this challenging and often harsh environment because they had a great knowledge about the plants and the animals in order to enable their prosperity. This ancestral culture of these tribes is still, in fact, very evident today, particularly the Tlingit tribe, whose craftsmanship you may be familiar with in woodworking in some of their tribal clan houses, as well as in their very famous totem poles. And I will be speaking about that as well today. So my travels in Alaska were on a number of different forms. I traveled a lot on the Alaska State Railroad, very famous train that cuts through the center of the state. I also traveled by sea on the archipelago of southeastern Alaska, known as the Inside Passage. And I then traveled by air. Traveling by air was certainly a dramatic way to get a grasp on the enormity of the state. And so in this program, I'll take you on that journey across the landscape of magnificent cedar and spruce forests, snow-white mountains like this, and blue-green glaciers. So we could take a peek at the map first. So this, the top of the map shows the state is covered with mountains, including toward the central part of the state. You may note Denali National Park, which Mount Denali is the highest peak in North America. And also you might note the irregular shape of the state, and that's because of the receding glaciers from the last ice age that then carved out these fjords or estuaries in the perimeter of Alaska. The string of islands going to the southwest is called the Aleutian Chain, and it actually extends right off the map. It extends some 1,200 miles. And then there is another string of islands that are in the southeast, bordering the west side of British Columbia. That's known as the Inside Passage. As a result of that string of islands, both east and west, the actual width of Alaska is some 2,400 miles and requires two separate time zones. The largest city is Anchorage, which is shown in the south center along the coast. The second biggest city is Fairbanks, which is more centrally located. But neither of those, the first or second largest, is the capital. In fact, the capital is a landlocked place called Juneau, about a small town, about 10,000 people, located along the Inside Passage. There are no roads that connect there. The only way to get to Juneau is by sea or by air. Finally, the map for orientation shows the north slope, the far north of Alaska, which was the source of Alaskan oil, from where the pipeline began, and the small town of Valdez on the south coast, which has the infamous occurrence of one of the world's worst oil spills that occurred in 1989, and one of the most terrible environmental disasters in the United States. So, with that orientation, I think we can begin. So, with its majestic mountains like this, its vast wilderness, and its untamed beauty, Alaska certainly, and I'm sure many of you have been there, Alaska has captured the hearts and imaginations of people from all walks of life. From explorers and adventurers to poets and writers, the last frontier has inspired countless individuals to put pen to paper and to express the essence of this place in words. So I'd like to begin this talk with some of the thoughts and feelings that have been written to convey the state's unique appeal. John Muir, who was the famous American naturalist, he's often called the father of America's national parks, he called Alaska a wilderness that touched my soul and filled me with awe and reverence for the natural world. Well, he went on to proclaim that, quote, if it is ever spoiled, it would be the greatest piece of vandalism ever committed. And then the American novelist Jack London, he said Alaska, quote, is a land of lost summers, a land of frozen dreams where life goes to sleep under blankets of white and wakes to find a half year's day. Well, in Alaska, certainly what impressed me to start was that everything was on a scale that dwarfed human imagination. First of all, of course, there's Mount Denali, the highest peak in North America. There is an ice field and glaciers that are the largest in the United States. Alaska has the highest percentage of land covered by forest, and just Alaska's sheer size itself. It is 2.5 times the size of Texas. It's nearly 1/5 the total land area of the lower 48 states. In fact, and I love this statistic, if Alaska were divided in two, Texas would still be the third largest. Well, Alaska is often recognized as having the most diverse and abundant wildlife in the United States, including the largest moose population. Apologies to the state of Maine. And indeed, it's been said that moose are the squirrels of Alaska. Well, more than half of the state is covered with mountains, and there are 39 separate mountain ranges, the most of any state, including 17 of the 20 highest peaks in the United States. Alaska is truly the last great wilderness in our country. Civilization has as yet encroached on less than 1/20th of 1% of its area. And so my wife and I recently visited there. This was her first trip and my second. And certainly covering such a large area, the state encompasses 6 different regions shown here. And each one of those regions has a somewhat different landscape, a separate history, and different people. Distinct among them are the far north, shown here in light blue, which is the northernmost region known for its massive reserves of oil. And then there is the southwest, shown in purple, including the Aleutian Island chain of over 300 small volcanic islands, which stretch out into the Pacific more than 1,200 miles. Indeed, the Aleutian chain extends so far west that it is on a different time zone from the rest of the state. And the state, as I mentioned, here are some of those Aleutian Islands. The state, as I mentioned, has a very unusual shape. Politely, it's been called an irregular polygon. A little less complimentary, it's been referred to as a lopsided, elongated blob. And when people we met wanted to indicate to us what part of the state they came from, invariably they would hold out their hand and make a fist with their thumb and pinky finger extended, which represents Alaska. So this side would become the Inside Passage archipelago, and this side became the Aleutian Islands, and then they could point with their other hand exactly where in the midst of all this they were from. Well, the indented coastline, though, has been a real boon for the development of the state because it's enabled the creation of very protected harbors, which support the fishing and shipping industries, as well as modern recreational boating. So for thousands of years before the arrival of any Europeans to Alaska, the land was occupied by numerous indigenous people. And these people had come over originally from Siberia in Asia, in Russia, and they crossed the body of water that separates Alaska from the eastern part of Asia. This body of water at various historic times has either been ice or it's been land when the sea levels were much lower, or, as is typical today, it is a water crossing, shown here by this broken black line. It was discovered by a Danish-born Russian explorer. His name was Vitus Bering, and as a result, we know this crossing as the Bering Strait today. Well, indigenous groups then came into the land that we know as Alaska today, and they are a significant presence in all parts of the state. They are themselves organized into various tribal entities, which are then further distinguished by clans and families. The federal government recognizes over 200 different tribes in Alaska that represent quite a diverse array of languages and cultures. And in fact, it was one of those indigenous people, an indigenous Alaskan boy, who was responsible for the design of the Alaska state flag. He won a contest in 1927. This is a photo of him holding up his design. His name was Benny Benson, and the design, rather simple, incorporated the iconic elements that are representative of the state, namely 7 gold stars of the Big Dipper in the constellation Ursa Major. Of course, that's the bear constellation, and there are indeed plenty of bears in Alaska. And then there's the North Star, which represents the future state. And this was done way before Alaska became a state, when it was still a territory, but it was then adopted as the flag. Now, it's also from one of the tribes, the Aleut tribe, along that Aleutian Island chain, that the name Alaska is derived. So in the Aleut language, their word for this territory is Alaksak, and that means, in their language, the mainland, or more literally, the object towards which the action of the sea is directed. Now, during our Alaska travels, we visited numerous tribal heritage museums and art centers and villages where indigenous history and native art were displayed and performed. There were dances, customs, and some of their artistry. And I'll speak more about this very rich culture a little later in the program. But let's enter the age of European exploration. The first Europeans to arrive here were the Russians. They came in the early 1700s, and they were specifically after these guys. These are sea otters, because at that time, sea otter pelts were judged to be the finest fur in the world. They were highly sought after. People paid high prices for them. And so the Russians came to hunt them. Unfortunately, they hunted them relentlessly. And for about 150 years, eventually their population was decimated. The Russians also forced labor of native tribes. to harvest these sea otters and take their pelts. But this was the thrust of the economy that the Russians brought to the Alaska Territory. And the Russian-American company monopolized the fur trade. They were supported by the Tsarist Russian Empire. And in 1808, they actually established a capital in their Russian territory on the island of Sitka. But once the sea otter pelts started to diminish, they really were a one industry colony, and their influence began to wane, their economic profitability waned, and so they sought around for a buyer of their land. The United States was quite interested. Under President Andrew Johnson, we purchased the entire Alaskan territory from Russia in 1867. Of course, this was an agreement between the United States and Russia. Even though the majority of the population were Alaskan natives, not one Alaskan native was consulted in this purchase that so much affected their livelihood. So the purchase price was $7.2 million, which in today's money, that's about $130 million. It was at first considered a total waste of money. The person who negotiated that was the Secretary of State, shown here, William Seward, and he was criticized. He was ridiculed in many publications as Seward's folly. Of course, at a mere 2 cents an acre, imagine, Alaska has ultimately proven to be a priceless addition to the United States for its resources, its natural attractions. Well, Seward today, of course, there's a major turnaround in his reputation. He is honored in commemorative plaques and statues, and the town of Seward in south central Alaska is actually named after this man. Now, although Alaska has been part then of the United States since the mid-1800s, beginning as a territory, it then became a state, as we know, in 1959. It was the 49th state, and this is a commemorative statue. This was during the Eisenhower administration. This is one statue that I happened to discover in Anchorage, looking not a whole lot like Dwight Eisenhower, but this is how he is honored there. There is, however, because the Russians were there for so many decades, there are descendants of the Russian colony that still remain in the state, and their legacy can be seen in many Orthodox churches like this, and also communities where Russian culture is still very much present through the practice of their traditions, their cuisine, and some place names within the state. And so in the 17th and 18th centuries, Alaska was descended upon by all sorts of explorers coming from Europe. And one of the things, they were looking obviously for natural resources, but what they were particularly desirous of doing is finding a shortcut to get to Alaska and to get to the Pacific. Because from Europe, in order to travel over to the west coast, to the Pacific, ships had to go all the way down the coast of South America and then turn at the very treacherous Cape Horn and then wind their way all the way up the west coast of South America. This, of course, was before the Panama Canal shortened that crossing. And so they thought, maybe there is a way to do this. Instead of going south, we can go north. And we can find a route that goes through from the Atlantic to the Pacific around the top of Alaska. And so as they sailed up from the coast of Alaska, they started to test the little indentations, of which there were many, to see if that, in fact, was the shortcut which would then carry them all the way across to the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, they were caught up short, because they would start going up one of these indentations, and lo and behold, after 10 miles or 20 miles, they would come to a dead end, and they'd have to turn around, and they were quite disappointed. And that disappointment is today reflected in the designations that they gave these places geographically. So on maps today, these designations have stayed. So they are mapped with names such as False Bay and Disenchantment Bay because of their disappointment in not finding the so-called Northwest Passage. Now, one of these bays was at the head of a 180-mile indentation that is now named the Cook Inlet. And that certainly seemed promising. After all, they went up 180 miles before they ran into a dead end. And that dead end became the city of Anchorage. And Resolution Park at the head of the bay is here in honor of Captain Cook's ship. It's now called the Cook Inlet. And there is a statue honoring the famous British explorer named after, again, his ship. And so ships that attempted to travel further north around the top of Alaska inevitably were confronted with an impassable frozen sea, and they failed to find a Northwest Passage. Of course, we all know that since then, 100 and some odd years, 200 years since then, there's been a lot of global warming. And a lot of the ice that prevented those early explorers from finding the Northwest Passage has now enabled, at certain times of the year, although it is still somewhat treacherous to cut through some of the ice that still remains, there have been successful journeys across the top of Canada and Alaska to shortcut the route between the Atlantic and Pacific. Now, and this is an aerial of some of those very narrow ice-filled channels. And so with such a large area in the state of Alaska, our 1-month trip there, we had to make a decision limited to which parts of the state to visit. And so we decided to travel in 3 of the state's regions, namely the interior, which includes Denali National Park, the south central area, which includes the largest city of Anchorage, and the southeast, which is a narrow coastal strip of land adjacent to British Columbia, the so-called Inside Passage, and that's the area that contains the capital, Juneau. Juneau, I'll speak about a little later, but this is a sort of advanced look at it. It has very colorful homes. But I must say, I've visited all 50 states, and when I go to those states, I typically take a peek at the state capital. And many state capitals are quite impressive. A lot of them model the U.S. Capitol in Washington. And I have to say that the state capitol in Juneau is perhaps the ugliest of all the state capitals I've seen anywhere in the States. Now, although our travels included a rental SUV as well as lots of daily walks and hikes, the most appealing and memorable transportation was on the historic Alaska State Railroad and also a 10-day cruise through the Alaska Marine Highway, known as the Inside Passage. So I want to first talk a little bit about each of these regions that we visited. The first one is the interior, noted here in red. This is Alaska's heartland. It includes the state's premier attraction, which of course is Denali National Park and Preserve. Now there is a north-south highway that connects between the coast, where Anchorage is, the state's most populated city, all the way up to Fairbanks, toward the northern end of this red area. But if you travel by road, especially if you drive yourself, you have to be quite vigilant, because a lot of the soil consists of frozen permafrost, and when it starts to melt in the spring, it also disrupts the pavement, and it undulates quite a bit. There's uneven dips and buckling of the pavement, so you really can't travel very quickly unless you want to be in for a very rollicking roller coaster kind of drive. Of course, you want to therefore keep your eye on the road, but you also want to keep your eye a little peripheral vision, because bounding across the road typically are also moose that can not give any warning when they enter the road, and you certainly do not want to collide with a moose because they weigh as much as 1,600 pounds. And so we didn't choose to travel that way. Instead, we decided it would be much easier and safer to travel on the Alaska State Railroad. And there are a number of routes to this railroad in Alaska. The flagship route is called the Denali Star and takes about 8 hours, traveling rather slowly, pleasantly, for a 230-mile distance between Anchorage on the south and Denali Park. It then continues another 140 miles to the town of Fairbanks. Now, most rail lines in the United States were built by private entities looking to take advantage of commerce and to make money in that way. But the Alaska Railroad is unique because it was government funded, because it was considered a matter of national interest, economic interest, as a critical link for transportation of all the natural resources, the gold, the coal, and other minerals that were plentiful in Alaska and needed to be brought to markets. As you can imagine, between the weather and the soil conditions and the mountains, construction problems were plentiful along the route. There were lots of avalanches, landslides. It was finally completed in 1923, and it was such a momentous achievement that the president at the time, Warren Harding, came to Central Alaska to hammer the final golden spike. But perhaps as a consequence of the fact that this was quite an arduous journey at that time for him to come from deep Washington to do that job, President Harding actually died of a heart attack just 2 weeks after this occasion. So the sights, needless to say, along the train route are stunning, enhanced by the train cars having the train windows having floor-to-ceiling domes for panoramic views. And as I said, the train speed is quite slow, about 30 miles an hour, often much slower, to allow views of the magnificent sights of the mountains. So this was the Golden Spike being put in. The views of the Alaska Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce is the state tree. Western hemlock, views of glaciers, rivers, fertile farmland, as well as crossing some magnificent trestle bridges high up above the terrain, and the occasional docilely drinking moose or bear. Well, appealing to me as an engineer certainly were the hundreds of very picturesque iron and wooden trestle bridges like this one that we rattled over. And often we passed through some narrowing of tree-bordered canyons and tunnels. Well, before arriving at Denali Park, there were also stops at a few towns along the way, and one of those stops is Wasilla. Now, you may, in the back of your mind, recall the name of Wasilla, Alaska, because it is, or was, the home of vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. Now, Alaska has consistently voted Republican in national elections, but Palin is generally disliked, from my discussions with people, in her home state. And so as a kind of tongue-in-cheek jab at Sarah Palin, when they put this important directional posting up, fourth from the bottom, they indicated Sarah Palin's house, about 159 miles away. I think that was certainly a tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic statement. So there's nothing that quite prepares you for the breathtaking experience of visiting Denali National Park. But first, I know, because I'm sure you've read about some of the political disputes regarding the naming of this park. It is freighted, as so much is today in the United States, with political overtones. So this park was designated in 1917 as Mount McKinley National Park. This was done to honor the recently assassinated President McKinley. But the mountain within this enormous park was known prior to that by various names, including Denali, which in the native Athabascan language means the high one or the great one. So the name of the mountain remained Mount McKinley, the park and the mountain, until President Barack Obama officially renamed it Denali in 2015. Of course, that brought out strong opposition from the politicians of Ohio, McKinley's home state, who objected to the change in the name. And then at the start of his second term, President Trump changed the name of the mountain back to McKinley. And that in turn, of course, drew criticism from the Alaskan lawmakers and native groups. Can't please both sides. Now, many Alaskans, including indigenous groups, continue, though, despite politics, to refer to the mountain as Denali. And they review this controversy, very correctly, as being absurd. Several locals cynically commented to me, they said, that's politics in Washington, and many of us don't even see ourselves as part of the United States. But indeed, the ongoing name change, I think, highlights, this conflict highlights the clash between honoring historical figures and recognizing indigenous cultures and traditional land stewardship. But none of this controversy can take away from the inimitable beauty experienced within the park. The park and surrounding reserve, they encompass an amazing size, nearly 10,000 square miles. That is larger than the entire state of New Hampshire. The landscape is a mix of forest at the lower elevations, and then as you go up in elevation, there is tundra with dwarf shrubs and grasses, mosses, and colorful lichen. And then as you get even higher, there are glaciers that come down the mountainsides, snow and bare rock. Well, glaciers indeed cover some 1/6 of the park's land, and there are over 450 species of flowering plants, including the very typical fireweed. Fireweed is one of Alaska's most recognizable flowers. It's typically the first flower that blooms after a region has suffered a forest fire, and so named fireweed. But the park's best-known geologic feature is certainly Mount Denali. Mount Denali is some 20,310 feet high. It is the highest mountain in North America, and it is even more spectacular because its relief, that is, the difference in elevation between the highest and lowest places that you can see at one point, is some 18,000 feet. And that is actually higher than any of the world's mountains, including Mount Everest. So, because at Mount Everest, you have to climb to a base camp, and then you actually can only see a rise in elevation that is lower, that is shorter than that. And due to the continued convergence of the tectonic plates under Mount Denali, the mountain is continuously being pushed up. It's growing. It's getting higher by a few millimeters every year. And in addition, the mountain is made of granite. Now, unlike our Appalachian mountains, which have been weathered to lower elevations over the millennia, the hard granite of Denali means that it is not subject to the forces of wind and water erosion, and so it maintains its height. Well, aside from the landscape, visitors come to Denali to spot the wildlife, of course, and there are wildlife tours operated within the park during the May to September season. It's also possible to take a private vehicle along the 92-mile park road. There are parking areas along that road that afford views and access hiking trails, and there are historic cabins that are evidence of early efforts by rangers to develop the park. So the park is also home to thousands of black bears and caribou and moose. There are hundreds of grizzly bears and dozens of wolves, many smaller mammals, including mountain sheep, and coyotes, beavers, and porcupine. It is quite extraordinary. For locations where we were told that bears might be present, we carried a can of bear spray, but fortunately did not have to use it. There are also lots of birds. Migratory birds reside in the park during late spring and summer, and they include dozens of species. This one looked kind of angry, I think, in this picture. Lots of species, including the willow ptarmigan, which is Alaska's state bird. It changes color from white in the winter as camouflage to brown in the summer. There are also an abundant number of raptors, including lots of bald eagles that you can spot, as well as golden eagles. Now, Denali Park is also the only sled dog kennel owned by the federal government, where sled dogs are raised and trained. And the park rangers continue to breed Alaskan Huskies for the traditional activity of mushing and working in the park to assist in its development, particularly during the snowy winter, of course. But lots of people come during the non-snowy season, and they want to see these how these dogs are working, and there are dog sledding demonstrations on bare rock for them to see. Well, despite its remote location, Denali Park gets over 600,000 visitors every year, most during the peak summer months when things can get a little crowded. There is an excellent visitor center, a restaurant, and camping areas within the park, but fortunately, all of the sprawling, rather ugly restaurants and hotels and other souvenir shops and bars and gas stations, all of that is kept outside of the boundaries of the park. So the second of Alaska's regions that we visited is called South Central, shown here in red. It consists of the shorelines and islands of the central Gulf of Alaska. The state's largest city is in this area, Anchorage. It has a population of about 285,000, about 40% of the total state population. And this city, Anchorage, contains a large proportion of indigenous residents. Now, although Anchorage has the fanciest hotels and restaurants, it has some of the best museums and galleries within the state, it's certainly the central departure point for the Alaska State Railroad. The cityscape, which contains lots of open parking lots and such, I didn't feel the cityscape was very impressive at all or attractive. It seemed to me the best feature was the backdrop, the mountain backdrop of snow-covered mountains, which are that way for most of the year. And so more appealing than Anchorage, we felt, was the smaller town of Valdez. This town only has about 4,000 people. It's a busy port right on Prince William Sound. It's filled with small homes and businesses and surrounded by some very beautiful wilderness of mountains, glaciers, and waterfalls. Valdez felt very natural and authentic to us, but for all its stunning appeal, the town and its reputation suffered from two sudden and staggering events in its recent history. And one of those events was nature-made, natural, and the other was, sadly, man-made. So, on Good Friday in March of 1964, a 9.2 magnitude earthquake struck the south central part of Alaska, very close to Valdez. This was the most powerful earthquake that ever occurred in the United States, and the second most powerful earthquake that has ever occurred in the whole world. The shaking lasted some 5 minutes. It caused massive devastation. In Anchorage, there were ground failures and landslides that caused huge lengths of the coastline to sink down 8 feet. Well, the earthquake also triggered a series of powerful tsunamis, and from those tsunamis, particularly, over 130 people died. But most of the destruction was in the town of Valdez, because Valdez was only 12 miles from the earthquake's epicenter, and the original town was completely destroyed, and a decision was made that they really could not. There was not enough to salvage. They could not rebuild this town, and so they decided to relocate the entire town some 4 miles away. Eyewitness reports by survivors, which are compiled in very chilling way in the local museum, describe ships and helpless crew being washed out to sea. Well, as horrific and an immense environmental disaster, man-made disaster, for both marine and aquatic bird life was the 1989 rupture of the oil tanker, the Exxon Valdez. The Valdez ran aground on a reef. It spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into the pristine waters of Prince William Sound. The spill impacted over 1,300 miles of shoreline. It killed thousands of seabirds and otters, seals, and other wildlife. And the cleanup was massive. Thousands of workers, boats, aircraft, they used every method known at the time. There was hot water treatment, there was high pressure cold water remediation, bioremediation. Interesting, they used solvents to clean a lot of the bird life, and the solvent they found that was the most successful was Dawn dishwashing soap. Many of you may recall that from then, and you can be sure that Dawn, the company that sells that, took advantage of that and used that. I think they still do. I think I saw an advertisement the other day. They still use that as a claim for the efficacy of this dishwashing liquid. This, by the way, is the pipeline. It runs some 800 miles from the North Slope down to the port of Valdez. Now, why did they choose Valdez? Well, it was chosen because it is the northernmost ice-free port in North America, so they could use it year-round. The oil was then transferred. This is a picture of the pipeline, mostly above ground, and it was transferred to the supertanker, the Exxon Valdez. There is a monument to the port. It took 8 years to build the pipeline. This was the first barrel of oil that came out of it, and there is a monument to the pipeline builders right in Valdez by the coast. So proceeding about 100 miles south from Anchorage, the Alaska State Railroad then terminates in the small port town of Seward. Seward, of course, named after the Secretary of State who negotiated the purchase of Alaska from the Russians. Seward has a lot of claims to fame. It is home to the Alaska Sea Life Center, one of the world's best marine aquarium, that contains many North Pacific mammals and birds, fish, and invertebrate. It contains also a medical facility where injured wild animals and resident animals requiring medical treatment are nursed back to health. And of course, being on the coast, fishing and the sea dominate life and dominate the economy of Seward. The town, in fact, is one of the most lucrative commercial fisheries ports in the United States, and it has a reputation worldwide, and certainly within the United States, for sport fishing, mostly for salmon and halibut, which attracts thousands of visitors annually. And of course, businesses have been set up where you can have your fish that you catch frozen and packaged and sent anywhere in the world. Now, when I visited, there was also an annual competition that was going on for military personnel who are stationed in this region. And here is the winning team proudly posing in front of their sizable halibut catch. Nearby is also a mariners' memorial that honors the memory of seamen who have lost their lives in the sea, out at sea, or have contributed to the local marine history. Now, Seward has a lot of things to recommend it. It is also very proud of its historic ties to the famous Iditarod Trail sled dog race. Now, this trail was originally set up for a very utilitarian purpose, and that is, it's some 940 miles, shown here in black, going from Seward all the way up to the west coast town of Nome, Alaska. And it was used for carrying mail and supplies with dog sled teams from this ice-free port in Seward across interior Alaska to Nome. And this was during the gold rush period, which started in the late 1800s. And so Seward has the distinction of sporting Mile Zero along Seward's seafront, which acknowledges the town's historic role as the starting point of this vital lifeline. Of course, now it's not used as a lifeline. Instead, it has become a sporting event, the Iditarod race, and for reasons of greater ease of popularity, they've moved the beginning of this race to Anchorage, taking it away from Seward. The actual race began in 1973, and it's intended to test the best sled dog mushers and teams. It usually takes between 8 and 15 days to get to the finish line, depending on the weather conditions, and the race certainly has evolved into a highly competitive sport. But aside from all that, Seward's and South Central region's premier attraction, I think, is the nearby Kenai Fjords National Park, which is on Resurrection Bay. The national park was established in 1980. It, too, is enormous. The bay's waters feature glacier-carved fjords, majestic mountain scenery, glaciers that were first formed some 23,000 years ago. And among them, the Harding ice field, shown here within the park, is the source of more than 30 different glaciers. Over one half of the park is covered by ice. The ice field receives some 60 feet of snowfall every year. The largest glacier is called Bear Glacier. It stretches some 12 miles long and 3 miles wide. And true to its name, as we passed on our ship by this glacier, we spotted a small black bear. Perhaps they posted it there for us, who knows, meandering around the rocks when we passed by. Now, we were so taken by all of this amazing ice, and we wanted to bring home some souvenirs. My wife thought, well, maybe she could bring home a piece of ice, but in fact, it didn't last the trip. Anyway, she gets disturbed when I show this picture. Kenai Fjords is explored primarily by small boat, from which you can view not only the dramatic landscape, but if you are lucky and have a good captain, you will get very close-up views of the animal life, the sea lions, the bird life, the cormorants, the porpoises. There are many humpback whales in this area, and especially the distinctively marked black and white orcas, known as killer whales, who travel in pods. One of the park's glaciers is accessible on foot, not on the boat, and this is a finger of cracked blue-white ice, which is called the Exit Glacier, because the first team who discovered it or explored it, they used a particular road to exit from the glacier, and so it's taken on this name from the first mountaineering party in 1968. And it can be reached by a wildflower-strewn winding trail in a valley just outside of Seward. So you could actually walk a couple of kilometers to this ice glacier. But the glacier is important for one particular reason, and that is it is a critical litmus test for how global warming has affected the melting of glaciers in Alaska and particularly in this part of the state. And that is that along this trail, they have installed signs that indicate how the location of the front edge of the glacier at a certain year. So you could see back in 2005, the ice actually came all the way to this point. But right behind it, of course, now there's rock, which means the glacier has melted. This glacier has had drastic retreating up the valley over 195 years. It continues to retreat. In fact, the retreat was nearly 300 feet. In just one recent year, it retreated 300 feet. Now, this melting of ice not only is a shocking indicator of global warming, but also it has localized a very adverse effect because as the ice melts, it has flooded the valley plain next to it and caused some very hazardous spills over the road and paths and other infrastructure. So Seward was the embarkation port for the third part of our Alaska journey, and that was to the southeast region, shown here, also shown at the bottom of your map. handout, which is known as the Inside Passage. The Inside Passage, for those of you who have traveled there, it is amazing, an amazing journey that wends its way in and around countless islands, passing through breathtaking channels, stopping at a handful of towns, including the capital, Juneau. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was my second trip to Alaska. I had first traveled the Inside Passage some 50 years ago, and at that time I did not have as much in the way of financial resources, and so I traveled on the much less expensive Alaska State Ferry, which still runs, and I slept out on the deck with many of my co-travelers, which was very comfortable, under a heated solarium, which had quite a community atmosphere. I have very fond memories of traveling that way. But in contrast, on our recent 10-day voyage from Seward to Vancouver, we traveled in relative luxury on the 740-foot, 5-foot length Viking cruise and had a terrace in our private cabin. So a bit of a change. Well, although our accommodations and food were significantly better, Alaska tourism, especially along this very popular Inside Passage route, has increased multifold since the first time I took this journey. And the ports that we stopped at and visited were often crowded with cruise ships that carried upwards of 5,000, 6,000, or 7,000 passengers that would then disengorge into these tiny towns. Over 2 million people take cruises each year in the region. And in fact, some of the communities are quite fed up with the onslaught of tourists and how it's affected their quality of life. And there's been quite a controversy between groups of people, many of them older, who have come here to retire and enjoy the pristine environment and do not want these big cruise ships coming in and impacting their streets and their shops and their towns. But and others who are younger, typically, who have started businesses here and depend for their livelihood on having this number of tourists here. So it's a real conflict, and there have been occasionally referenda to decide whether, in fact, some of these tour ships, cruise ships, should be limited. Yet, even with the distraction, with hundreds of people loading up on the streets of these small towns, cannot mar the unique beauty and grandeur of the journey. The sheltered sea route along the Pacific Northwest coast of North America stretches about 1,000 miles from Seattle, Washington to Skagway, Alaska, and the portion within the state of Alaska itself is about 500 miles. The ship passes close by the surrounding landscape. A lot of the channels are quite narrow. You're close to land. Views take in lush, dense evergreen forests, predominantly of Sitka spruce and hemlock and cedar. And the skies, as you see here, are often cloud-covered and foggy because, after all, the Inside Passage passes through the world's largest temperate rainforest. And so there is abundant rainfall, which has supported the growth of large trees and a very diverse ecosystem. You can also spot frequent rainbows. There's as much as 150 inches of rain annually, and occasional lighthouses on the islands peek out from the fog picturesquely. Now, although it's possible to have a memorable experience by just staying on the ship and looking out at the scenery, there are also excursions at ports of call that enable you to do all sorts of activities: hiking in the wilderness, rafting on the rivers, fishing in the lakes. You can take an historic train to the former gold fields up in the Yukon Territory, or ride a float plane over the glaciers. These were not only unforgettable adventures in terms of the scenery, but also these journeys enabled us to meet, to contact and meet and speak with a lot of local Alaskans and seasonal workers, to get away from the people who were on the ship itself, sharing it as tourists. And these people seemed genuinely delighted to spend all of their time or part of their time during the tourist season in a place that they love, despite the challenges of the weather and the high cost, because it does cost a lot more in Alaska. Lots of things, nearly everything has to be imported, except, of course, fish, which is quite plentiful. Well, among the highlights of the voyage were our close-up viewing of a glacier called the Hubbard Glacier. Hubbard Glacier, our ship got very close to. It's some 76 miles long, going back 76 miles. It's 7 miles wide. It's the largest tidewater glacier in North America. Tidewater means that its front edge ends at water. And it's especially famous, especially now that the atmosphere is heating up more. It's famous for its frequent and dramatic caving events where enormous multi-ton chunks of ice break off and crash down 300-400 feet into the water. You can imagine this creates a thunderous sound, spectacular displays. Our captain had to be careful not to get too close to this possibility. Of course, enjoying this sight, which we did and photograph, is, I would have to say, a guilty pleasure, because it is direct evidence of global warming and glacial melting. We also visited the town of Juneau, which is the state capital. It was named the state capital in 1906, and this town sits very snugly against a mountain backdrop. Now, all the towns along the Inside Passage are along the water, of course, and many of them have an unusual shape because when the glaciers receded from this area and carved out the very deep channels of the Inside Passage waterway, they also left very steep mountains. So there isn't a lot of land to build anything adjacent to the coast. And so many of these towns are simply 1 or 2 or 3 parallel streets back from the water. The mountains then rise dramatically, and you can't build anything there. So they're longitudinal, they're long, and they're kept rather small. Even in places like Juneau, if you just go 2 blocks inland and start encountering this elevation change, you have to use these long runs of stairways to get access to the homes. The southernmost Alaskan town on the Inside Passage is called Ketchikan. It's considered the gateway to the Alaskan Inside Passage coming from the south. The original town was built along the mouth of something called Ketchikan Creek, shown here. They built a raised boardwalk above the creek. It was originally an infamous red light district known as Creek Street. Today, of course, Creek Street brothels have been replaced by a succession of souvenir shops. It's still a very pretty setting, but it's lost some of its edge to it, if you will. Although tourism is still big business, Ketchikan is known as the salmon capital of the world. Indigenous people first settled here because of the abundance of salmon that spawn in the area. In fact, nearly 60% of all wild seafood and 95% of wild salmon harvested in the United States comes from Alaska, most of it from Ketchikan. Now, arguably the highlight, literally, of our time on the Inside Passage was a seaplane ride over the Juneau ice field. Our cruise ship, of course, could bring us right up, almost up to the edge, front edge of these glaciers, and that was dramatic enough, but then flying over them for miles truly revealed their enormity and their three-dimensional beauty. The Juneau ice field covers an area of 1,500 square miles. It's home to over 40 large valley glaciers. Like many glaciers, it's been in retreat, in this case since the 1700s. Other than the vastness of the glaciers, which was striking, the irregular ice surface deformed with fissures and crevices, shown here, and the brilliant patches of meltwater when the blue-green color of the underlying dense glacial ice shines through in areas of melt. Well, before completing this talk, I'd like to speak a little bit about what I mentioned earlier, and that is the indigenous people of Alaska. Their presence here has so very much shaped the state's history and culture. What I learned from them on this trip could easily fill another one-hour program, but I will share with you some of what I saw and learned. Alaska's indigenous people live in all regions of the state. They are jointly called Alaska Natives, as opposed to American Indian, which generally refers to indigenous people in the lower 48 contiguous American states. Currently, approximately 1 in 6 Alaskans is a native Alaskan. Alaska Native refers to 11 distinct cultures. Their location approximately conforms within the state's 5 geographical regions, and these groups and their subgroups are often categorized by their distinct languages. There are some 22 different Alaska Native languages. And the government of Alaska has done a good job of recognizing Native culture where there are presentations of various geographic attractions. They will invariably also provide the translation into the original Native language. The Alaska Native peoples are culturally diverse, and their culture can be described in terms of their belief systems and their customs and their traditions, how they physically express those beliefs in their buildings, in their artifacts, and their art. For some of these groups, how they express them in wooden totem poles. Now, although Alaska Natives share some similar problems to American Indians in the lower 48 states, including, sadly, alcoholism and suicide, these problems did not appear to me as prevalent in any of the places I visited. Whereas American Indians have historically been gathered on reservations with land originally held by the United States government, the system of native reservations has never existed in Alaska. Instead, Alaska has specially formed native villages and regional corporations that are owned and managed from the start by their own people. While historically, of course, there has been discrimination against Native Alaskans, just as in the lower 48 states, the Alaskan Native control of their own land, control of their own development, has translated, I believe, into a greater self-worth and pride in their heritage. In terms of their culture, Alaska Natives embrace customs and traditions that are rooted in quintessential values of community and especially a deep respect for nature. Many believe that all living things have spirits and animals are deeply revered. Their beliefs and stories and legends serve as a moral guide. They help bind the families and community passed down from generation to generation. Historically, Alaska Natives have inhabited almost every part of the state. Traditionally, they moved seasonally to hunting and fishing grounds to support their subsistence way of life. Alaska Native peoples have protected their lands for thousands of years. Over time, they have developed the ability to detect anomalies in nature before anyone else can. And for some of these groups, climate change is producing severely adverse impacts on their lifestyle and their ability to survive. The physical manifestation of Alaska Native peoples is expressed in their art and architecture. Now, in Western culture, we often separate the art and architecture by its utility and its beauty. That is, there are many items that are built for utility, something that we need in our daily lives. And then there is art, which is often placed in museums to admire. In the Native Alaskan code, in their beliefs, they do not separate utility from beauty. In fact, this distinction is blurred. Many of their artifacts are designed with both purpose and great beauty. Boots and sun caps such as this were meticulously crafted to serve the community's needs, but are also gorgeously designed and today are displayed in museums and private collections. Well, the greatest contact I had with a native Alaskan craft was the Tlingit group in southeastern region. The Tlingit kinship system contains two distinct groups, as shown here, the raven, who represents wisdom, and the eagle, representing strength. And these and other subsidiary animals underpin Tlingit moral values, and they are carved into their two most important constructions, namely ceremonial houses and totem poles. Tlingit ceremonial houses which have been displayed or reconstructed around the region, particularly of Southeast Alaska, typically would house 10 or more families. They lived communally. They had separate sleeping areas on the sides. There was a central fire pit. And they are gorgeously carved and decorated both inside and out. And then I found totem poles to be the ultimate expression, synthesizing native Alaskan art and values. A highly important part of the society of Tlingits and 3 other clans in the southeast region, these totem poles were previously mistaken and thought to be religious, but in fact they are not religious. They are symbols of a community's history, values, and tradition. They make use of animals in the poles to demonstrate each culture's interpretation of the spiritual meaning of the wildlife around them. And every aspect of a totem pole holds very great cultural significance. Even the wood that is chosen to carve it, which is typically a large red cedar tree. So I had the opportunity to visit a totem pole carving shed. A totem carver usually begins honing their craft at a very young age. It's seen as a very honorable and important role in the community. Ketchikan, owing to its Tlingit population, has the world's largest collection of standing totem poles. They can communicate a narrative, but mostly they mark a family's lineage and validate the powerful rights and privileges that the family holds. Well, in summary, my travels in Alaska were limited to only parts of this huge state. Its size leads many people to actually keep a small plane in their garage instead of having a car because they have to go large distances, or perhaps to have a seaplane parked waterside in the back of their home. Yet the landscape and culture imparted to me a wealth of experiences and knowledge that the state has to offer beyond my limited time there. Now, I've had the opportunity, as I mentioned before, to explore every one of our 50 states. I believe that Alaska is the richest in terms of its deep history, its breathtaking scenery, and the contributions of its people. Thank you very much. Between the edge of where Canada ended and then where the Russians were able to settle the archipelago of Russia that extends down the coast. Also, they were very interested at one time, the Russians were, in extending their empire all the way down the coast of the United States, down to San Francisco, down as far as Mexico even. And so they were very interested in colonizing little by little. That's why they chose their capital within that area of the Inside Passage of Sitka. But ultimately that didn't work for them. Oh boy, answered all your questions. Great. All right, well, thank you all very much, and thanks for coming, and I will be back. Sarah, I think my next program is going to be on Tuscany? Yeah, on Florence and Tuscany. Be a little different than this one. Could be. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So in the meantime, stay well. Good travels if you're still traveling a lot. Enjoy the world, and see you next time. Thank you.